Welcome back to the Product Safety Podcast, brought to you by AMS Consultants. Today we're diving deep into something really fundamental for product safety in the EU. It's that whole journey from legislation to the standards that actually make it all work.
Oh yeah, it's a wild ride for sure.
I think everyone who's ever worked on launching a new product in the EU knows that feeling. You're all excited, and then bam, you're just drowning in a sea of directives and regulations and all those mysterious harmonized standards.
Oh, absolutely. It can definitely feel overwhelming.
But don't worry. We've got you covered. We're
Mm.
going to break it all down today. We've got a whole stack of resources here, and we're going to go through the EU's entire approach to product safety.
Yeah, we'll start with those basic legislative building blocks, and then we'll work our way up to the more intricate world of standards development.
Exactly. It's going to be a fascinating journey, I think.
Absolutely. And just a quick reminder before we get started, the content of this podcast is for general information purposes only and is not intended to convey legal or other professional advice.
Yes. Always good to have that disclaimer out in the open.
Safety first, even in our discussions. Right.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, so first things first. Can we maybe just talk about the different kinds of legal acts that the EU uses? I have to admit, it's all a bit of an alphabet soup to me sometimes. There's regulations and directives and decisions.
Oh, I know, right? It can feel like you're learning a whole new language. But it helps if you think about it like this. Each one of these acts has its own unique role to play in setting the stage for product safety. So for example, you have regulations. They're kind of like the heavy hitters, They're directly applicable in all the member states.
Okay.
It's like having one uniform rule book that everybody has to follow no matter what.
So no matter where you are in the EU, the same regulations apply. That makes sense. But then what about directives? They seem a bit more flexible, right?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Directives are more like a set of goals. They tell you what needs to be achieved in terms of safety outcomes, but they don't really specify how you have to get there.
So each country has a little bit of wiggle room to adapt the directive to their own specific context.
Exactly. As long as they meet those core safety objectives that are outlined in the directive.
Okay, so it's about finding that balance between flexibility and consistency. What about decisions then? Where do they fit into all of this?
Decisions are more like targeted strikes.
Mhm.
They're used to address very specific cases or entities. Like, for example, let's say there's a dispute between two companies about how to interpret a particular safety requirement. The European Commission might issue a decision to clarify things, kind of provide a binding resolution.
So it's like having a legal referee step in and settle a disagreement.
Exactly. And that helps to fine-tune the system and make sure the rules are being applied consistently.
Okay, so we've got our different types of legal acts down. Can we maybe zoom in a bit on the new legislative framework, the NLF? It sounds like a pretty big deal.
It really is. It's all about creating a much more unified and streamlined approach to product safety in the EU. It kind of shifts the focus away from very detailed technical specifications and moves more towards these overarching safety principles.
So instead of saying your product must have a guard that's this exact thickness, it's more about saying your product needs to be designed and manufactured in a way that prevents people from getting injured.
Precisely. It's more about the overall goal of safety rather than dictating exactly how to achieve it. And that's where this concept of essential safety requirements, or ESRs, comes into play. They outline the fundamental safety objectives that all products need to meet. Think of them like the non-negotiables.
The bedrock of safety. Okay, I'm seeing how that shift to principles could be really helpful, especially with technology evolving so rapidly. You don't want to get bogged down in specific technical details that might become obsolete very quickly. But then, if the legislation is focused on these high-level ESRs, how do we get down to those nitty-gritty technical details that manufacturers actually need to follow?
That's where harmonized standards come in. Think of them like the instruction manual for meeting those essential safety requirements. They lay out specific technical specifications and testing procedures that manufacturers can follow to demonstrate that they comply with the legislation.
So it's kind of a two-tiered approach, right? You have the NLF setting the safety goalposts and then the harmonized standards providing the playbook for reaching those goals.
That's a great analogy. And it gives you both clarity and structure, but it also allows room for flexibility and innovation, which is important.
So if a manufacturer follows a harmonized standard, they can be pretty confident that their product is going to meet those essential safety requirements.
Yes, and by extension, the legal requirements. It's a powerful tool for manufacturers. This idea of using harmonized standards to gain what's called a presumption of conformity.
Okay, so it's not just as simple as picking a standard off the shelf and calling it a day. There's a lot more to it than that.
Oh, for sure. There's a whole fascinating process behind how these standards are developed and updated. But but before we go down that rabbit hole, I think it's important to understand the roles that different EU institutions play in this whole legislative dance, if you will.
Right, because it's not just a single entity calling all the shots. It's more of a complex interplay between different actors.
Exactly. It's like a multi-layered cake. You've got the European Commission, you've got the Parliament, the Council, and a few others. They all have their own piece of the puzzle. So the European Commission, think of them like the baker, you know. They come up with the initial recipe for new legislation.
So they propose new directives and regulations.
That's right. And they play a key role in coordinating market surveillance activities. And they also provide guidance documents to help manufacturers understand the requirements.
Okay, so they're kind of setting the table. But then what about the European Parliament? Don't they have a say in all of this?
They absolutely do. Think of them as the taste testers, you know? They debate and they scrutinize the proposed legislation to make sure that it's palatable and that it meets the needs of all the different stakeholders involved.
They get to add a pinch of salt or a dash of pepper to make sure the recipe is just right.
Exactly. They have the power to make amendments to the proposed legislation before it goes to the council.
And the council is kind of like the head chef, right? They get to decide whether the dish actually makes it onto the menu.
You got it. The council represents the member states, and they need to give their final approval before a new directive or regulation can be implemented.
Okay, so we have the commission proposing, the parliament debating, and the council approving. It's a fascinating process to see how it all works together. But what about enforcement? Once these laws are in place, who's actually making sure that everyone is playing by the rules?
Ah, yes, enforcement. That's where things get really interesting. So each member state has its own set of market surveillance authorities, or MSAs for short.
So it's like having a team of safety inspectors in each country.
Exactly. They're the ones on the ground doing the inspections and investigating complaints, and they're the ones who take action if a product doesn't meet the safety requirements.
But what happens if a dangerous product is found in one country? Is there a way to alert other EU member states so they can take action as well?
Absolutely. There's a system called RAPEX. It stands for the Rapid Alert System for Dangerous Non-Food Products.
Okay.
It's like a network of watchdogs all across the EU, keeping an eye out for any products that pose a serious risk to consumers.
So if they find a dangerous toy in, say, France, the French authorities can use REPEX to quickly share that information with their counterparts in other countries.
Exactly. And that allows them to quickly remove that toy from the market across the entire EU. It's a really powerful tool for protecting consumers.
That's good to know. It's reassuring to see that there's this level of coordination and communication happening behind the scenes. But it's not just about top-down enforcement, is it? I mean, I've read that the EU also recognizes the importance of stakeholder involvement when it comes to shaping these product safety measures.
Absolutely. You know, it's not just about bureaucrats making decisions in a vacuum. The EU really does try to involve the people and organizations that are most affected by these regulations.
So manufacturers and consumer groups and industry representatives,
Yeah.
they all get to have their say.
Exactly. And that's really important because it helps to make sure that the rules are practical and effective and that they reflect the real world needs of all the different stakeholders.
It's kind of like a collaborative safety ecosystem, isn't it?
I like that. Everyone has a role to play in ensuring product safety.
Okay, well, this has been really helpful. We've covered a lot of ground here. Talked about the different types of EU legal acts. We've talked about this new legislative framework, the NLF. We've even touched on the role of harmonized standards and how they fit into the whole system. But before we move on, I want to go back to those harmonized standards for a moment. You mentioned this idea of presumption of conformity earlier. Can you maybe unpack that a little bit more?
Sure, yeah. So basically, if a manufacturer is making a new product, let's say it's a power tool, and they want to make sure that it complies with all the relevant EU safety requirements, they can look for a harmonized standard that specifically covers power tools.
Okay.
And if they follow that standard carefully during the design and manufacturing process, they can be pretty confident that their power tool will meet those essential safety requirements, those ESRs that we were talking about earlier. And that confidence comes from this presumption of conformity. It essentially means that by adhering to the harmonized standard, they've kind of shifted the burden of proof, so to speak. Instead of having to prove from scratch that their power tool is safe, they can point to their compliance with the standard as evidence that they've met the legal requirements.
Okay, that makes sense. It can save manufacturers a lot of time and money and headaches if they don't have to prove everything from scratch.
It really can. But it's important to remember that this presumption of conformity isn't an absolute guarantee. There are a few situations where things can get a bit tricky.
Hmm. Like what?
Well, for one thing, harmonized standards aren't static documents. They're
Yeah.
they're constantly being revised and updated to reflect, the latest technological developments and new scientific understanding of risks and feedback from stakeholders, things like that.
So a standard that was perfectly good a few years ago might be completely out of date today.
Exactly. So manufacturers need to be very careful about staying up to date with the latest versions of the standards. Otherwise, that presumption of conformity might not hold up.
That's like trying to navigate a city with an old map, right?
Yeah,
You could end up getting lost or running into some unexpected roadblocks.
it's a great analogy. So staying informed about any changes to harmonized standards, that's really crucial.
Okay, so that's one potential pitfall.
Mhm.
Are there any others?
Another tricky situation can come up if a product is particularly innovative, like if it uses new technologies that aren't really addressed by the existing standards.
So the standards haven't caught up with the latest and greatest innovations.
Exactly. In those cases, manufacturers might need to take extra steps to demonstrate compliance, even if they've followed the existing standards as closely as they can.
So they might need to do additional risk assessments, maybe provide more detailed documentation
Mm.
to show that they've carefully considered the unique safety implications of their new product.
Exactly. And that's an area where communication and collaboration with regulators and standardization bodies becomes even more important. It's about having those conversations and making sure everyone's on the same page.
It sounds like navigating the world of harmonized standards really requires a blend of uh, diligence and adaptability and a good dose of clear communication.
Absolutely. You've got to stay on your toes and be ready to adapt to the ever-changing landscape.
Okay, so we've talked about the legal framework, we've talked about the role of harmonized standards. Can we maybe dive into that six-step CE marking process now? That's the part that I think trips a lot of manufacturers up. It just seems like this very complex dance with all these intricate steps.
Yeah, it can be a bit daunting, but it helps if you break it down into bite-sized pieces. So the first step is all about understanding the lay of the land, figuring out which directives and regulations apply to your specific product. It's like laying the foundation for a house. You can't start building without a solid plan.
Okay, so you need to define that legal framework first. Got it. What's step two?
Step two is all about defining the requirements. This is where those essential safety requirements, the ESRs, really come into play.
Right.
The manufacturer needs to carefully analyze those ESRs and figure out how they apply to their specific product.
Okay, so two steps down, four to go. What's next?
Step three is all about choosing the right dance partner, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
You need to select a conformity assessment procedure, or CAP.
A CBAP.
Yeah, and there are several different CAP modules to choose from, so it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. The CAP that you choose has to be tailored to your specific product and the regulations that apply to it.
Okay, so it's like choosing the right dance partner for a particular routine.
Exactly. Some CIPs might involve testing the product in a lab, while others might focus on reviewing the design documentation or maybe auditing the manufacturing process. It all depends on the specific requirements.
Right. Okay, so we've defined the legal framework, we've identified the requirements, we've selected a CIP. What's next?
Now it's time to put on your dancing shoes and really get moving. Step four is all about conformity validation.
Okay, so this is where the manufacturer puts the CAP into action, right?
Yeah.
They gather evidence that their product actually meets all the requirements.
Exactly. And this could involve conducting tests, doing risk assessments, reviewing design calculations. It's all about generating that solid evidence that the product checks all the boxes.
It's not enough to just say, trust us, our product is safe.
Yeah,
You actually have to prove it.
precisely. And that brings us to step five, which is all about getting organized and putting all your ducks in a row. It's time to compile the technical file.
The dreaded technical file.
I know, it sounds scary, but it's really just a comprehensive document that outlines the product's design and its construction and how it operates, along with all the evidence that demonstrates compliance.
Okay, so it's like the product's safety resume.
That's a great way to put it. And finally, we reach the grand finale, step six, Affixing the CE mark.
This is the part manufacturers get excited about. It's like the final stamp of approval.
It is, but it's important to remember that it's not just a sticker you slap on a product. There are specific rules about how and where that CE mark should be displayed.
Right.
So
Yeah.
you have to make sure you're following the guidelines carefully. Otherwise, you could end up with a CE mark that's not valid, and that could lead to a whole host of problems down the road.
Okay, so 6 steps, lots of details, lots of potential pitfalls along the way.
Yeah.
But if you take it one step at a time and you do your homework, it's manageable.
It absolutely is. And the payoff is huge. You get to put that CE mark on your product and know that you've met the EU's high standards for safety.
That's a great feeling. Okay, so we've covered the CE marking process, but before we move on, I want to talk about risk assessment. It's such a fundamental part of ensuring product safety. And I'm curious to know where it fits into this whole CE marking puzzle.
Risk assessment is like the backbone of the entire process. It's not a one-time activity. It needs to be an ongoing process that's woven into every single stage of product development.
So from the initial concept all the way through to the final design and even beyond.
Exactly. It's a continuous loop of identifying potential hazards, evaluating the risks, and implementing appropriate measures to reduce those risks. Manufacturers need to constantly be asking themselves, what could go wrong and what can we do to prevent it?
Okay, so it's about being proactive and anticipating potential problems before they happen. But how does this risk assessment actually work in practice? What are the steps involved?
Well, there's a really useful framework outlined in ISO 12100. It's like a step-by-step guide to systematically identifying hazards, evaluating the risks, and determining what measures need to be taken to reduce those risks. So the first step is to define the scope of your assessment. What are the limits of the machine or process you're looking at? Who are the intended users? What are the foreseeable use scenarios? You need to set some boundaries.
Okay, so you're not trying to assess the risks of everything in the entire universe.
Yeah.
Exactly. You need to narrow it down. Once you have a clear scope, the next step is to identify all the potential hazards that are associated with the product.
Okay, so how do you do that?
It could involve brainstorming sessions with experts, maybe reviewing accident data, conducting user surveys. It's really like being a detective.
Okay.
You're gathering clues to try to uncover all the different ways that the product could cause harm.
And once you have that list of potential hazards, what happens next?
Then you need to estimate the risk that's associated with each hazard. And that means you need to consider both the likelihood of the hazard occurring and the severity of the harm that it could cause.
So a hazard that's very likely to occur and could cause a serious injury would be considered a high risk,
Exactly.
whereas a hazard that's unlikely to occur and would only cause a minor injury would be a lower risk.
Precisely. And that level of risk is what helps you to determine how urgent and how extensive the risk reduction measures need to be.
Okay, so that makes sense. You've identified the hazard, you've assessed the risk, and now you need to figure out how to actually reduce that risk. Are there any specific guidelines for doing that?
There are. The EU uses what's called the three-step method for risk reduction, and it's a hierarchical approach that prioritizes the most effective ways to reduce risks.
The three-step method. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So the first and most effective step is inherently safe design. It's all about trying to eliminate the hazard right at the source. Designing the product in a way that makes it inherently safe rather than relying on add-on safety features as an afterthought.
Okay, so you're building safety into the DNA of the product from the very beginning. Can you give me an example?
Sure. Let's say you're designing a new food processor. Inherently safe design might involve using materials that are less likely to shatter if the bowl is dropped. Or it might involve designing the blades in a way that minimizes the risk of cuts during cleaning.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about being proactive and thinking about safety from the very start. What's the second step?
The second step is safeguarding. And that's all about adding protective measures to prevent contact with hazards that couldn't be eliminated through inherently safe design.
So things like guards and barriers and interlocks.
Exactly. Safeguarding is about creating a physical barrier between the user and the hazard.
Okay, so inherent safe design eliminates or reduces the hazard. Safeguarding puts up a barrier. What's step 3?
Step 3 is all about providing users with clear and comprehensive instructions and warnings. We call that information for use.
So things like user manuals and warning labels and training materials.
You got it. The goal is to make sure that users are aware of any hazards that are associated with the product and that they know how to use it safely.
Right, because even the safest product in the world can be dangerous if it's not used correctly.
Absolutely. Information for use is about bridging the gap between the product and the user, making sure that the information is clear and effective.
Okay, this has been really helpful. We've gone from these high-level principles of EU legislation all the way down to the details of risk assessment and the CE marking process. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I just want to touch on one more thing. You mentioned this principle of state of the art earlier. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. The state-of-the-art principle means that manufacturers are obligated to comply with the applicable safety requirements to the greatest extent possible, using the best available technology and knowledge that's out there.
So they can't just get away with using outdated technology and say, well, this is the best we could do.
Exactly. They need to stay up to date with advancements in safety technology, and they need to incorporate those advancements into their designs.
So it's about pushing for continuous improvement.
Absolutely. The state-of-the-art principle really is a key driver of innovation in product safety.
Well, this has been fantastic. We've really highlighted how all of these different elements are connected. The legislation, the standards, the risk assessments, the CE marking process. It's a complex system, but it's all designed to keep consumers safe.
It's a great way to put it. It's all about working together to create a safer world for everyone.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive, but we're not done yet. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll delve even deeper into the fascinating world of harmonized standards.
We're going to explore how those standards are developed, how they evolve over time, and we'll talk about the challenges of keeping up with this rapid pace of technological advancement. It's going to be an exciting journey, so don't miss it.
Welcome back to part 2 of our deep dive. We were just talking about the state-of-the-art principle. That's a really important concept to grasp. It ensures that, products are reflecting the latest in safety thinking. But I think it's time to really roll up our sleeves and get into the nitty-gritty of harmonized standards. Yes, let's unpack these harmonized standards a bit. I mean, they're clearly a key piece of the puzzle when it comes to gaining that presumption of conformity, which we were just talking about. But I'm curious about the process itself. Like, how do these standards actually come into existence?
Well, it's actually a pretty fascinating process. It's not just a bunch of experts sitting in a room, dictating rules. It's actually a very collaborative effort. There are a lot of different players involved, and they each bring their own perspective and expertise to the table.
Okay, so who are some of the key players in this world of harmonized standards?
Well, the main actors are the European Standardization Organizations, or ESOs for short.
So.
Yeah, you might have heard of some of them, like CEN, CINELEC, ETSI. These are the organizations that are tasked with developing and maintaining these harmonized standards.
So they're kind of like the architects of the EU's technical infrastructure when it comes to product safety.
That's a great way to put it. They take those essential safety requirements, those ESRs we were talking about, and they translate them into these concrete technical specifications that manufacturers can actually use. But it's not a top-down process. They don't just work in isolation.
So how does it work? I mean, how do they actually go about creating a new harmonized standard?
Well, often it starts with a mandate from the European Commission.
Okay.
The Commission will identify an area where a new standard or maybe an updated standard is needed. And they'll basically say to one of these ESOs, like, hey, we need a harmonized standard for X, and it needs to address these specific safety concerns.
So the commission kind of sets the stage, and then the ESO takes the ball and runs with it.
Exactly. And that's when the collaborative magic really starts to happen. The ESO will assemble a technical committee, and they'll bring in experts from all different areas, manufacturers, consumer groups, industry representatives, people from research institutions, you name it.
Wow.
It's a real melting pot of perspectives and expertise.
And that's all focused on crafting the best possible standard.
That's the goal. And that diversity is really crucial. You want to make sure that the standard is technically sound, but you also want it to be practical. You want it to be enforceable. And you want to make sure it reflects the real world needs of all the different stakeholders.
Right. You need to find that sweet spot where it's rigorous, but it's also workable.
Exactly.
Okay, so this technical committee gets together. They start hashing out the details. They come up with a draft. What happens next?
Well, once they have a draft that they're happy with, they don't just, keep it a secret. They put it out there for public scrutiny.
That's interesting.
Yeah, the draft standard is published, and anyone who has an interest, whether it's an individual or a company or an organization, they can submit comments, they can submit suggestions.
So it's a very transparent process.
Very much so. And the more eyes that you have on the document, the better the chance of of catching any potential flaws or oversights, and those public comments are taken very seriously. The technical committee will review all of the feedback, and they use that feedback to refine and improve the draft standard.
Okay, so it's an iterative process, lots of back and forth, lots of fine-tuning.
Exactly.
What happens once they feel like they have a solid draft?
Well, then it's time for the final test. It goes to a formal vote by all the national standardization bodies from each EU member state.
Wow, so every member state gets to weigh in.
That's right. And that helps to make sure that the standard has broad support and that it reflects a consensus view across the EU.
Okay.
And if it passes that vote, then it becomes an official harmonized standard, and it gets published in the official journal of the European Union.
That's pretty impressive. It's quite a journey from initial mandate to final publication.
It is.
It's really interesting to see how many steps are involved and how much collaboration goes into creating these harmonized standards.
It really is. It's a real testament to the EU's commitment to creating a system for product safety that's both robust and reliable.
Right.
But the work doesn't stop there. Remember how we talked about how technology is always evolving? Well, these harmonized standards, they need to keep pace with those changes.
Right, so it's not a set it and forget it kind of deal.
No, not at all.
These standards need to be living documents. They need to be constantly adapting to the changing technological landscape.
Exactly.
So how does that happen? How do they stay current?
Well, most harmonized standards have a review cycle. It's typically every 5 years or so. And during that review, the technical committee will get back together. They'll assess whether the standard is still relevant, whether it's still up to date, and they'll consider any feedback or changes that might be needed.
It's just like going back to the drawing board.
Yeah.
But now you have the benefit of hindsight and experience.
Exactly. They can incorporate new knowledge, they can address any new risks that have emerged, and they can just fine-tune the standard to make sure it's still fit for purpose.
But what happens if technology is advancing so rapidly that a standard becomes outdated before that scheduled review?
Well, in those cases, the Commission can actually request an accelerated review if they think it's necessary. They can also publish guidance documents to clarify how existing standards should be applied to these new technologies or emerging risks.
So there is some flexibility built into the system.
Absolutely. And that flexibility is essential in a world where technology is constantly pushing the boundaries.
Right.
Things are changing so fast, you need a system that can keep up.
Okay, this has been incredibly helpful. I'm starting to see how this whole system of harmonized standards is really a cornerstone of the EU's approach to product safety.
It is. It's really the foundation upon which everything else is built. It provides that framework for making sure that products meet those essential safety requirements, but it also allows for innovation,
Right.
allows technology to advance. It strikes that balance between safety and progress, which is so important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's not a perfect system, is it? I mean, are there any challenges, any limitations to relying on harmonized standards in this way?
Well, one challenge is that sometimes harmonized standards can lag behind those latest technological advancements, especially in areas like, artificial intelligence or nanotechnology where things are moving so quickly.
Right. It's like trying to hit a moving target.
Exactly.
By the time the standard is developed and published, the technology might have already moved on.
That's right. And that can create some uncertainty for manufacturers because they might be trying to comply with a standard that doesn't really address all the nuances of their innovative product.
So what can manufacturers do in those situations?
Well, communication is key. Reach out to the relevant ESO, explain your situation, seek guidance on how to best demonstrate compliance. Manufacturers can also participate in the development of new standards or updated standards.
Right.
Share their expertise and help shape the future of product safety. It's a two-way street. Manufacturers can benefit from harmonized standards, but they can also play an active role in making sure that those standards stay relevant and effective.
It's a collaborative process.
Very much so. It requires engagement and communication from everyone involved.
Okay, this discussion has really highlighted how dynamic these harmonized standards really are. It's not just about following a set of static rules. It's about being adaptable, staying informed, and working together to make sure that products are meeting the highest safety standards, even as technology continues to evolve at this really rapid pace.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's a journey, not a destination.
Well said. Well, I think this brings us to the end of part 2 of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the development of harmonized standards. We've talked about the review process. We've talked about some of the challenges of keeping those standards up to date in a rapidly changing world. And now I think it's time to shift gears again and talk about some of the other key players in this EU product safety ecosystem.
Yes, I think it's time to delve into the mysterious world of notified bodies.
Notified bodies, they sound a little bit intimidating.
They do, don't they? But they play a really important role, and I promise they're not as scary as they sound.
Welcome back to the Product Safety Podcast.
And welcome back to our deep dive into the EU's approach to product safety.
It really is fascinating to see how this all comes together. From the legislation to the standards, all these different players involved, it's quite a system.
It is a complex system,
Mm.
but it's designed to be comprehensive. It's designed to be effective, and as we've seen, it's constantly evolving to keep pace with new technologies and emerging risks and all that. It's a living, breathing thing. This system.
And speaking of keeping pace, before we wrap up today, I did want to touch on something that you mentioned earlier, these notified bodies. Can you explain exactly what they are? What role do they play in this whole product safety ecosystem?
Yeah, notified bodies. Think of them as like the independent auditors, of the EU's product safety system.
Yeah.
They're organizations that have been designated by member states to assess and certify products against specific directives.
So they're the ones who can give manufacturers that official stamp of approval, say,
Right.
yep, this product meets all the requirements.
That's right, yeah. They provide this extra layer of assurance for both consumers and regulators, but their involvement isn't always required. It really depends on the product, the risks associated with the product, and the specific directive that applies.
Okay, so how does a manufacturer know whether they need to involve a notified body or not?
Well, that information will typically be outlined in the directive itself.
Sure.
It'll tell you, if you need a notified body, if so, what type, and then you need to select one that has been designated for that particular directive.
Okay, so if a manufacturer does need to involve a notified body, how do they go about finding one?
Well, luckily, the European Commission maintains this database. It's called NANDO, the New Approach to Notified and Designated Organizations. And it's a publicly available database.
Okay.
And it lists all the notified bodies, their areas of expertise, and the directives that they're authorized to assess. So it's a really useful resource for manufacturers.
That sounds incredibly helpful. It takes all the guesswork out of the equation. So what happens when a notified body does get involved? What does that assessment process look like?
Well, it can vary depending on the product and the directive, but typically it involves a thorough review of the technical documentation. Risk assessments, test reports, quality management systems, things like that.
Right.
And they might also do like on-site inspections of the manufacturing facilities.
So it's a pretty comprehensive evaluation. They're really digging deep to make sure that the product meets all the requirements.
Absolutely, yeah. Their job is to provide an objective and independent assessment. They need to make sure that the product complies with all the applicable standards and regulations. They're really a vital part of maintaining a high level of product safety throughout the EU.
Okay, so we've talked about notified bodies. Is there anything else we should know about navigating this world of EU product safety?
Well, one more key player I want to mention is the authorized representative.
The authorized representative, I remember seeing that term in some of the materials we've been looking at. But who are they and why are they important?
Yeah, the authorized representative, or AR for short, is particularly important for manufacturers that are based outside of the EU.
Okay.
So, if you're a manufacturer and you don't have a physical presence in the EU, then you need to appoint an AR who's established within the EU to basically act on your behalf when it comes to CE marking and product compliance.
That makes sense. It'd be pretty difficult for, a company in Asia to handle all the CE marking requirements and all the communication with EU authorities, from halfway around the world.
Exactly. So, the AR acts as that bridge between the manufacturer and the EU market. They're responsible for things like holding the technical documentation, making sure the EU Declaration of Conformity is available, and they act as a point of contact for the EU authorities.
Okay, so they're basically like the manufacturer's boots on the ground in the EU, making sure that everything is running smoothly.
Exactly, yeah. Their role is really to facilitate communication and just make sure that, manufacturers that are based outside the EU are able to comply with with all the relevant requirements.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here, but you really helped to break down these complexities of EU product safety and make it all a lot clearer.
I'm glad to hear that.
Well,
It's
yeah,
not always easy to wrap your head around all of this stuff, but it's really important information for anyone who's involved in bringing products to market in the EU.
absolutely. And a huge thank you to our listeners for joining us on the Product Safety Podcast today. We hope you found this deep dive into the world of EU product safety helpful. It's a complex topic, but it's one that's absolutely essential to understand if you want to succeed in this market.
Right. And remember, product safety is a journey, not a destination. Regulations change, standards evolve, technology keeps advancing. You've got to stay informed, and you've got to be ready to adapt.
Absolutely. Well, we'll be back soon with another episode exploring different aspects of product safety, compliance, and risk management. But until then, stay safe and stay curious.
See you next time.